For those few people that don't know what AB 32 is, it passed in 2006, sponsored by Arnold Schwarzenegger. And it basically mandates that California will reduce its level of carbon emissions to the level that existed in 1990. And empower the Air Resources Board, primarily the Air Resources Board, the PUC has a little piece of the action, the Energy Commission has some piece of the action, to adopt regulations that are aimed at reducing that carbon emission to 1990 levels. SB 375 is essentially a land use bill that says that local land use policies have to be brought into compliance with that goal by adopting land use policies that limit or reduce the amount of vehicular travel and make development toward near mass transit stations and so forth more important, have a higher priority. They were passed, particularly AB 32 was passed during an election year, 2006, and Arnold Schwarzenegger was seeking re-election. He had come off a very brutal special election campaign in 2005 that had dropped his popularity down into the 30% level, and he was worried about re-election. He was looking for something splashy, something that he basically surrendered to the legislature and said, okay, I can't fight the legislature anymore because these ballot makers got killed. I surrendered here. And he said, give me what you will so I can have a record for the 2006 re-election. And one of the things that they gave him was AB 32 because it had a kind of a big splashy, it was high concept, it had a kind of a lot of political sex appeal to a lot of people. And remember, the economy in 2006 was just booming. So people didn't feel like, you know, it has had some economic component. It was a kind of a feel-good thing. California will be first in the world. We're going to lead the nation. We're going to lead the world in reducing carbon emissions. Now, of course, 4 years later, the economy is in deep recession, and we have a measure on the ballot, Proposition 23, that, if enacted, would say that AB 32 would be suspended until unemployment had dropped to 5.5% for 4 consecutive quarters. Now, let me talk a little bit about what the effect of all of this would be. First of all, if Proposition 23 passes, it would not repeal AB 32. It would merely suspend it. But the global warming program adopted by the state of California goes way beyond AB 32. Part of it is contained in other legislation, including SB 375. Part of it is by executive order. For example, the governor, through the Air Resources Board, is going to order utilities to obtain 33% of their power from so-called renewable sources, basically solar and geothermal and wind, by 2020. That would not be effective if Proposition 23 passes. That's something that's being done by the Air Resources Board and partially by the Public Utilities Commission. There was a study done by the University of San Diego Law School, came out a couple of weeks ago. A very objective thing, just saying what Proposition 23 would affect and what it wouldn't affect. Basically, it would affect about 50% of it. 50% of the anti-global warming program. The rest of it would still remain in effect unless the next governor either repealed it by the executive order or something else would happen. It's therefore kind of in some ways, just as AB 32 itself was kind of a symbolic act. I mean, after all, as Joe said, what we do in California will have a minuscule impact on carbon emissions in the global sense. So in many respects, it was a symbolic act. It was kind of getting California out front, kind of a big splashy thing. Now, the advocates of it say it will also create the next great economic wave in California of green jobs. The other side says, no, it won't. It'll have the negative effect on jobs. And so you have all sorts of competing university studies floating back and forth on that effect. But just as it was a kind of a symbolic act itself in 2006, Proposition 23 is also something of a symbolic act itself, because it wouldn't repeal the law, it would merely suspend it, and it wouldn't suspend the whole program, only parts of it. So it's one of those things, and basically it's going to depend on, even if 23 fails, which I tend to think it probably will, it largely would depend on the next governor. If Jared Brown's elected, he's an enthusiastic supporter of AB 32. He's basically sued communities all over the state, including some in this area, to enforce the provisions of SB 375 before they were even in law. He's an enthusiastic supporter. Meg Whitman says she would suspend AB 32 at least for a year, even though she says she's opposed to Proposition 23. So this, like water, is one of those things that's literally up in the air. Not the point of phrase. What's actually going to happen in all this is very, 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 very problematic. It depends on who the next chairman of the Air Resources Board are, who gets appointed to the board, who's not appointed to the board. It's like the water thing. Who gets appointed to this agency over supervising the Delta, who doesn't? The laws are just basically a kind of a framework, a kind of a goal-oriented thing. Cut carbon emissions. Make the water system work better. It'll all be left basically to these unelected boards and commissions to make rules to decide. I mean, they can expand that whole concept a little further. If you take AB 32 and 375, that's one thing. You take the water thing, that's another thing. You take the bullet train, number 3, and finally the thing that Arnold Schwarzenegger just signed, which is creating another state agency, the Health Insurance Exchange, that supposedly implements Obamacare, but basically goes way beyond that, and will actually assume responsibility for setting health care policy for the entire state, which is basically the largest single economic sector in California, healthcare, about $200 billion a year. You take those 4 things, bullet train, AB 32, 375, the Water Act, and this new health exchange, what you have in the thing is a proposed remaking of much of the California economy. Will be dictated by the rulemaking of these agencies. How they do whatever they do over the next several years, which will largely depend on who the governor is that controls those, will have an enormous effect on it. Water, transportation, land use, health care. What else is there? That's basically the underpinnings of the entire economy. And that's what's really going on here. That's what's up in the air right now, is essentially the entire economic future of California would be largely dependent on how these unelected bodies, High-Speed Rail Commission, the Health Exchange, the New Delta Commission, the Air Resources Board, the Energy Commission, and the Public Utilities Commission, interpret their mandates under these laws to shift California into the so-called green world with windmills, high-density development, bullet trains, other mass transit, stricter water conservation, or whether California will move in a different direction. This is the very thing. You're not hearing the candidates for governor talk about this, are you? You're hearing them talk about nannies and what Jerry Brown did as mayor of Oakland, or what he did as governor in the last place, or whether Meg Whitman was a good leader. None of this is being discussed in the governor's race, but these are truly the stakes involved in this year's elections. Essentially the whole future of the state, because under Arnold Schwarzenegger, these mechanisms have been created. He will leave the governorship before they actually act. So the next governor will then have these mechanisms that they can move in one direction or another. And that's truly the stakes of this governor's election.
So to take that a step further, Dan, do you foresee a future in which a pro-business governor would be able to step in and undo some of the damage that's been done over the last decade and move California in a more positive direction for business growth?
Well, without using your editorial comment, the next governor will have an opportunity to move these regulatory mechanisms that have now been created the last few years. This is all very recent. Think about it. This is all brand new stuff for the most part. The next governor will have an opportunity to move that in the direction that appears to be headed now, or change direction. Because what this does is it creates, by passing frameworks of laws but leaving their interpretation and implementation to these commissions, basically controlled by the governor and with a few legislative appointments, you then create a mechanism. You've centralized in the control over land use in 375, which was hitherto a local government function. transportation policy, in both 375 in terms of the bullet train, water policy in this new commission, and of course all these regulations dealing with carbon emissions and utilities all have been moved into these new authorities that are fundamentally controlled by the governor. And they can move in any direction that governor sees fit. So like I said, these are the real stakes of who's elected governor next time, this year. I mean, all this other stuff is just kind of fluff. This is what's really going on, because California's economy now is at kind of a crossroads. We've had 30 years of boom and bust. We've not really competed in a normal economy since the 70s. We had the defense boom in the 80s, the high-tech boom in the 90s, the housing boom of the aughts, all went bust. We've not had a really normal economy for 35 or 40 years. The question is, what kind of an economy, and therefore parenthetically, what kind of a state will we have off into the future? Will it be this kind of green utopia that the advocates of AB 32 and these other issues propose? Or is that just a pipe dream, as Joe says, and the jobs will really go someplace else even if there is this green revolution? Or what? We really don't know where this economy of California is headed. We haven't had a normal competitive economy. What we've had is 3 bubble economies, once a decade, driven by huge infusions of capital that then created bubbles that burst. We haven't had a normal economy for so long we wouldn't know what one came up and hit us in the face. So the real question is, where is California headed in an economic sense? Into becoming Michigan on the left coast, or renewing this kind of utopia, California utopia of the 60s and 70s where everything was kind of in sync? We really don't know. But these agencies that have been created will, in large measure, shape that. If, for example, AB 32 results in a 35 to 40% increase in utility rates, your clients will feel that, certainly. Or if the new water thing raises water costs by 35 or 40 or 50%, that will affect land development and all sorts of things. I mean, these are all things that are juggling around right now out there in the cosmos, and nobody knows which direction they're headed. And this is really what's really going on in California right now.
Michigan on the left coast, that's
I can follow up just on one point, mentioning utility costs, and glad you did that. Apple has recently opened a new $1 billion server farm in a very attractive little town, Maiden, North Carolina. I didn't realize server farms are huge consumers of electricity. One published account said that they will save between 70 and 130% on their electric bill by building that in North Carolina instead of California. But guess what? Apple is one of the companies that's part of something, and I forget the name of it, the Silicon Valley Action Group or something.
Silicon Valley Leadership Group.
Leadership Group. And they are active in supporting keeping AB 32, vote against Proposition 23, they say. So and there are other companies, not just Apple, who are supporting that position because it is so politically correct to do that in Silicon Valley. Well, they are transferring, I used the word billions earlier, literally billions of dollars of capital to lower cost electrical utility places like North Carolina, Mississippi, Colorado, and Oregon. Those 4 come to mind. And Nevada, those 5 come to mind.
What was the company that got that big federal grant in Silicon Valley to make solar panels on their new technology? What was the name of it? Obama was making a big thing about it.
Soliax, I think.
Something like that.
Something.
It's where are they building their plant? Georgia.
Georgia.
That's right.